I'll sit up here. I'll sit up here. Am I? Teresa, I don't know if you can hear me. I am not in the Zoom room, but supposedly you should be able to hear me. So we might want to test your audio real quick to make sure that that you can share and do all of the stuff that you need to do for your presentation.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I wonder if you all see this. Is there a way to switch between the Zoom call and mine? Oh, wunderschön. Hi. Do you want to test anything really quick, or do you feel pretty good about it? There are people here already, just to let you know.
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Yeah, you.
I'm good. I'm just reading. I'm not sharing slides, so I feel good.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Thank you for checking.
Okay, so that worked.
Yeah.
Cool. Can we go back to mine? Hi. Welcome to the Comedy Central roast of Penny Eckert. No, I'm just kidding. My name's Jay Calder. Welcome to the whole Linguist. This panel, we're going to be celebrating the work of Penny Eckert. I'm going to keep my intro short because I don't know that Penny wants me to gush over her a lot right now. And we're going to be gushing over her for the next 2 hours. So I'm going to keep my, and we have a lot of panelists to get through. So I'm going to try to keep this short, but I will start with a personal anecdote. So the very first time that I presented FEM in a professional situation was years ago when I was TAing for Penny's language and gender class, and I wore a skirt and some really pointy boots. And I was not made at all to feel like that was abnormal or out of the ordinary. And I feel like that really illustrates Penny's remarkable ability to see people. Like, she sees you, and even sometimes when you don't want her to see you, she sees you. And she can read a bitch for filth. And it's always helpful. You're going to get read for filth, but it's going to help you, and it's going to make your scholarship so much better. And her ability to really see people is probably a huge reason why she's such a brilliant ethnographer, because we want to see people on their own terms and understand people on their own terms. So that's something that all of us here today really appreciate. Although I've been lucky enough to have worked personally with Penny and to have been personally influenced by her, her influence, of course, has affected the fields of sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology much more broadly than me. And I think this panel is going to make that fact really clear. We have a lot of panelists. I think we have 13, if I counted right. So we have a lot to get through. But what each of us is going to do is we're all taking a topic that's related to Penny's work, and we're going to expound on it for 5 to 7 minutes. We'll be very optimistic about this. We're all academics. We know how this goes, but we're going to be real optimistic. And then at the end, Penny's going to come up and give some remarks and maybe cuss us out, or I don't know what she's going to do, but she's going to come up here and have the opportunity to talk to all of us. So I've babbled long enough. So let's get the show on the road. I'm going to go first, and I'm going to be talking about bricolage. Of the many important contributions Penny Eckert has made to the field of sociolinguistics, one of the most interesting for me is the introduction of bricolage to the study of language in its social context. Bricolage originally describes a style of art where works are constructed from various materials, coming together to comprise a whole that means something more than the sum of its parts. In this picture of Queen Elizabeth made out of buttons, beads, and other tchotchkes, we see various individual resources contributing something to a composite that becomes recognizable as signaling something in itself, Queen Elizabeth. And it's not really until a resource is situated in such a composite that something like a round beige button comes to mean the tip of Queen Elizabeth's nose. And qualities of the individual resources, like the beigeness and roundness of this button, contribute something to the overall meaning of the composite, like the roundness and beigeness of the tip of the Queen's nose. Anthropologists and sociologists have applied bricolage to the study of signs, examining how signs come together and assemble into larger wholes. Such perspectives argue that what signs signify or what meaning they contribute to larger packages depends on the other signs in the ensemble. That is, the meaning of the individual sign may shift when situated in the larger ensemble, and the individual sign may contribute something specific and meaningful to what the ensemble comes to signify. In Subculture, the Meaning of Style, sociologist Dick Hebdige applies the term bricolage to the study of aesthetic style, discussing how members of youth subcultures juxtapose materials against each other to create larger styles that are legible as meaningful and recognizable phenomena. For example, British punk rockers of the late 70s and early 80s incorporated utility items like chains and safety pins into their visual aesthetics. And it isn't until chains and safety pins are incorporated into the punk rock style with other articles of clothing that they become meaningful as items of clothing or accessories rather than as utility items. And given their original status as utility items with qualities like sharpness or hardness with the safety pin, for example, they contribute a sharp or hard edge to the overall punk rock style. Eckert's work in a California high school in the 1980s illuminates how individual signs can be mixed and matched between existing styles, contributing nuances of meaning to a new style. Two salient social groups in this school were the preppy kids and the new wavers, with the preppy kids wearing straight leg pants and pastel colors, and the new wavers wearing peg pants tied around the ankle and almost exclusively black. Eckert describes a group of popular girls who incorporated pegged pants into their overall preppy style, arguing that the inclusion of this one element of the new wave style into their own serves to make their own style stand out as more independent than that of the other preppy kids. In other words, the incorporation of pegged pants contributes an edge to these girls' larger style based on its meaningful association with the edgy new wavers, while the tendency to retain colored clothes prevents these girls' styles from indexically straying too far to the extreme, like the scariness that the overall style of the new wavers might index for these girls. Applying the idea of bricolage to language variation allows us to move beyond one-to-one mappings between linguistic variables and larger identities, with such mappings assuming that each linguistic variable needs to index identity in a particular way in order for the speaker's larger semiotic performance to index that identity. Instead, it may be sufficient for a single linguistic sign in a larger package to index an identity, contributing the meaning of that identity to the larger style. Lal Zimin, in his work with transgender men in California, has elegantly illuminated how gender is accomplished via stylistic bricolage, rather than being necessarily reflected by each individual element in the linguistic system. He examines vocal pitch and frontness of S articulation among trans men, and these are two variables that have been linked with gendered meanings in previous literature, with a higher pitch and a fronter S indexing femaleness or femininity, and a lower pitch and a more retracted S indexing maleness or masculinity. In Zimin's work, he argues that not every trans-masculine individual needs to exhibit both a retracted S and a low vocal pitch in order for their overall gendered style to index maleness. Rather, one or the other is sufficient to imbue their style with the meaning of maleness. Put another way, even if a speaker exhibits a fronted S, other signs in their package, like a low pitch, are sufficient to indexically imbue masculinity to their style. In my own work, I've explored bricolage across modalities, examining how gendered variables like S interact with visual gender presentation among a group of drag performers in San Francisco. While we might expect that individuals who visually embody a gender presentation that's more conventionally feminine to exhibit a more fronted S that also indexes femininity, in my work with this community, I've actually found the opposite. It is the queens whose visual style is less conventionally feminine that exhibit a more fronted S, and the queens that look more like cis women actually exhibit a more retracted S. While both types of queens identify with queer femininity, I argue that the less conventionally visually feminine queens can use linguistic variables to contribute the meaning of femininity to their overall styles, while the more conventional queen's visual appearance does much of that semiotic work. In other words, the semiotic division of labor is such that either of these modalities may be sufficient to index femininity in order for the overall cross-modal package to be imbued with that gendered meaning. Bricolage invites us to consider how multiple signs relate to each other in larger composites and how they come together to contribute meaning to larger wholes. As a trans femme individual whose gender performance is often at odds with cis-normative expectations, I've become acutely attuned to gendered bricolage in my daily life. And I'll conclude this discussion with a few questions that thinking about bricolage has raised for me in my own research and my lived experience. When signs combine into larger packages, which signs are necessary for the overall package to index something and which signs are merely sufficient? For example, is it necessary to visually look like a cis woman in order to be read as something other than a man? Or is it sufficient to employ other gendered signs in the overall style to do that gendered work? When multiple signs combine into larger packages, can the indexical work of one sign override the indexical work of another sign? For example, if my voice rings at a low pitch indexical of masculinity, can other signs in my composite override what that low pitch index is such that my overall style can index femininity? Finally, how can we think about indexical weight in these larger composites? If my body indexes one thing and my voice indexes another, which carries more weight in contributing gendered meaning to the overall package? And might some of us start to become able to use a broader range of gendered signs to project ourselves as complex and multifaceted composites that aren't simply reducible to either man or woman on the base of one sign or another? Thinking about bricolage as a meaning-making enterprise invites us to further consider such questions, probing the relations between signs. And while this discussion leaves us with more questions than answers, I believe these questions suggest much promise for the future of sociolinguistic study. Thank you. So all of our panelists deserve 2-hour introductions, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to do this really bare bones. So our next panelist is Judy Irvine, who's going to be talking about indexical field.
Thanks, and I'll try not to take 2 hours. I'm really grateful to the organizers of this session because I'm so glad to be able to participate at last in this celebration of Penny Eckert and her work. Penny is such an exciting intellectual interlocutor, and she's also a generous friend. As Jay indicated, my topic for today is indexical field. I'm drawing mostly on her 2008 article, Variation in the Indexical Field. It was reprinted as a chapter in her 2018 book with a few brief comments there that are also of interest. And she mentioned it again yesterday. And I picked this topic because I've found it inspiring to think with. Now, let me start with how Penny defines the indexical field. The 2008 article is part of a broader manifesto for sociolinguistics, arguing against the kind of sociolinguistics that separates language from society and treats society as a set of static external categories. This paper situates the linguistic variable firmly within an evolving social world. A speaker's linguistic choices are part of a constellation of style or persona constructing features, many of which, such as clothing, are not linguistic. And the social personae are always under negotiation. Although the social meaning of a linguistic variable works indexically, pointing to some social category or attitude or situation, the indexing is never just mechanical. What a variable indexes is affected by and through the semiotic act. Such acts, she emphasizes, take place within an ideological framework that orients the participants and constrains what the linguistic variable can be understood to index. That ideological field, as Penny calls it here, crucially organizes the indexical possibilities. So the indexical field of a linguistic variable is, quote, a constellation of meanings that are ideologically linked. Discussing two examples from work on American English, ing and t release, Eckert shows how the meaning, that is the indexical value, of a linguistic variable is built up from indexical associations, ever accreting more of them. These accretions have implications for linguistic change when their relative importance changes. The indexical field, then, is the ever-evolving representation of this continual reinterpretation and accumulation of meanings. Now, this is my launch point for taking the idea of indexical field a little further and showing why it inspires me. First, as Penny points out, grasping what a feature means in some context relies on grasping what its meaning is not. I like to make this point even more salient than she does. So my imagined indexical field would incorporate that point into the indexical field itself. The contrasts involved in indexical relations are systematic, and they're crucial to how meanings take part in an ideologized social landscape. Penny has left them outside the indexical field, at least in her diagrams of that. But I think there's much to be gained by bringing them inside, as what is always also indexed, if only by its absence. And Sue Gall and I have done something of the sort, building in these contrasts in our work on linguistic differentiation. A second thing is that I would emphasize point of view, a position take on social meanings that mediates between what's in an individual's head and some broader grouping or social system. In her 2018 book, Penny writes that she sees a problem with the indexical field construct. She says, it isn't clear where the field lives. She repeated that yesterday too. Is it in her own head? Is it in a speech community? To address this problem, I think we need to consider the positioned points of view and perspectives that mediate between the participant and the sociolinguistic landscape. And this is actually something Penny has always done. For example, with the jocks and burnouts and with the two California groups that you just heard about. So I'm just putting one piece of Penny's work more explicitly together with another piece of Penny's work. And as I've argued elsewhere, the concept of ideology depends on some such notion of difference in point of view, differences in the ideas and assumptions people hold that arise from their differing biographies and role-related experiences in society. So have I just turned the indexical field into the linguistic part of the ideological work Sue Gall and I have written about? No, not exactly. Though I have wanted to point out how Penny's work is inspiring and how it has influenced me. Now, looking at Penny's diagrams again of the indexical field, sorry, I didn't make a slide to show you, but I'm struck by the way they're organized. The indexical meanings are laid out as a set of simultaneous possibilities. Granted, the appearance of simultaneity is partly because context and situational specifics are left out of the diagram. And surely not all these meanings are available in the same way at the same time. And yet something these diagrams capture that makes me think about them is that many meanings can lurk in the background of whatever move the speaker makes, and that our interpretive schemes are multiple. People fluctuate among them and hold several in their head at once. It's like a kind of multiple semiosis, which does sound like a disease, sorry. But how does this multiple indexicality work? And how does it relate to point of view and to power relations? Do some people have to hold more indexical meanings in their heads than other people have to? Be more alert to the implications of their talk or of anybody's talk. In short and conclusion, the indexical field is a very fruitful construct, especially when put together with Penny's other work, that holds lots of interesting questions to think about.
Up next, we have a recorded video from Annette D'Onofrio talking about iconicity.
Hi, Penny. Hi, everyone. So I'll be talking about iconicity. And many of you might be familiar with this distinction I'm showing between these two shapes. But for those who aren't, I want to start with a little quiz. So if you reflect on which of these shapes here is the kiki and which is the buba, or which is the maluma and which is the tekete, I'm guessing we have a pretty strong consensus. And I first learned about this effect in the first seminar I ever took in graduate school with Penny, my first year of grad school. So you might be asking yourself, as I did at the time, what does this have to do with sociolinguistic variation, or more importantly, with Penny Eckert? Well, let's zoom out a little bit to talk about social meaning and signs, which I'm sure lots of folks on this panel will touch on. So the structural origins of linguistics have privileged certain conceptions of the sign, particularly those that see the relation between the signifier and the signified as abstract and arbitrary. So the conventionalized relation between a string of sounds or letters like dude and the concept of this dude, whoever he is, has been said to be what makes language language. And these signs are thought to exist in a sort of abstract grammar of a language. And it's even been argued that sign relations outside of this realm aren't part of the object of inquiry of capital L linguistics at all. But as all of us know, Penny has a knack for doing away with this kind of academic gatekeeping to try to really understand what's happening for actual people in actual interactions, to get at the heart of what's going on when we see sociolinguistic variation. So first, in studying variation at all, we necessarily have to look at types of sign relations outside of this referential one between arbitrary form and meaning. So most quantitative sociolinguists, sociophoneticians are thinking about the index, or a sign in which forms and meanings are in a relation that's a function, particularly that of co-occurrence. So for example, here we can see that quantitatively, the use of discourse marker dude, or maybe the fronted oo vowel in dude, indexes Californianness, since Californians are thought and observed to be the ones who produce these features. But as Penny has pointed out in her work over and over again, if we care about how speakers and listeners use these features agentively in styles, we have to focus on social meaning. So a question that emerges for us is, what do these social meanings look like, and how do speakers and listeners understand and construe these form meaning associations, and where do they come from in the first place? So this brings us to iconicity. Penny has urged sociolinguistic variationists to consider that while many relations between these linguistic variables and their social meanings might be indexical, speakers and listeners themselves often construe them as natural or iconic. So icons are signs whose forms are related to their meanings via resemblance or sharing some kind of quality. So in an iconized relation, while it is itself conventionalized, it's a relation where it's a seemingly kind of natural connection between form and meaning. So a classic example of this here is the relation between vocal tract length, body size, and acoustic frequency, which has gotten mapped onto iconic associations between pitch and size more generally. So a higher pitch or fundamental frequency, F0, is construed as associated with relative smallness, whereas lower pitch is associated with relative largeness. But this can extend to other types of associations. So lower versus higher acoustic frequencies in both F0 or pitch, but also in F2 or frontness or backness of vowels and consonants, can be associated with other qualities that kind of map onto these size differences, perhaps. So things like heaviness and lightness, darkness and lightness, or of course, our buas and kikis, roundedness and spikiness, where backer vowels with lower F2 like oo and o get mapped onto more rounded shapes, and fronter vowels with higher F2 like e get mapped onto more spiky shapes. Sound symbolic associations like these are typically argued to be outside of the traditional scope of inquiry in linguistics, but Penny helps sidestep this as well, pointing out that processes of iconization inform how sociolinguistic variables get and retain their meanings for individuals in interactions. So in Penny's analysis of one pre-adolescent speaker, Colette, she showed that fronter versus backer productions of vowels also corresponded to expressions of positive versus negative affect. So nice Colette spoke happily and sweetly about Josh, But negative Colette a year later was very frustrated and talked about Josh, who was kind of a jerk at the time. And in an experiment we conducted a few years later, we provided evidence that listeners also hold these same iconized associations between vowel backness and positive versus negative affect in perception as well. So this happy dude on the left might explain a more fronted dude, while this sad dude on the right might produce a backer dude. We can also use phonetic lengthening or fortition for expressive intensification, like the sea turtle does, as he says, dude. And the same goes for repetition, as in one of Penny's favorite examples, damn, damn, damn. These features and their social meanings fall outside of the scope of more traditional sociolinguistic variables, since they don't correlate with broader macrosocial categories like class or region. But as Penny has pushed quantitative variationists to observe, they're essential to speakers and listeners in interaction, who use them to demonstrate affect, to take interactional stances, and construct personae. She points out that not only are these iconized meanings not incidental to how variation works, but in fact, they're central, since a crucial function of linguistic variation is its ability to serve this expressive role. And it's also what underlies the broader sociolinguistic patterns of variation that we see. So in pushing the boundaries of what counts as a variable into the iconic realm, Penny's given quantitative sociolinguists, including yours truly, the license to be thorough and expansive in our understanding of how speakers and listeners use linguistic variation to make and represent meaning in all of the ways that we can understand meaning.
Up next, we have Sue Gall talking about sociolinguistic scale.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It is a pleasure to honor Penny Eckert and her relationship with linguistic anthropology. I've picked sociolinguistic scales to talk about. This is not a rubric included in Jeremy Calder's helpful list of topics, but I find it strikingly present, if not always thematized, in Penny's decades of work. Interscalar relations are an underlying theme, I'm going to claim, and a provocation in much of her work. The process of scale making and scalarity is currently a hot topic in linguistic anthropology, so it is ripe for recognition as yet another form of productive intersection and convergence of sociolinguistics as now present in many linguistics departments and linguistic anthropology, which didn't used to be so separate from each other. They used to be much closer. And now closeness is between the sociolinguistics that Penny has spearheaded in linguistics departments and Ling Anth. So I first met Penny when she was in an anthro department at the University of Michigan. I've been reading and learning from her since the early 80s, when we both worked on minority languages in Europe. Her discussions of Gascon and its relation to French in so-called diglossia pointed up the sham of supposedly peaceful coexistence of two languages. In reality, as she showed, this was a scene of struggle. Gascon was suppressed by its stigmatization as a low variety, plus the Occitan language movement that proposed raising Gascon's standing through linguistic unification, which we now call standardization, erased or devalued much of the variation that made Gascon what it was. Recognition of this in my own work was really helpful, helped by reading Penny. The contradictory and widespread process was made visible through Penny's simultaneous attention to what was happening at different social scales, in homes and streets, more broadly in political movement, and in the state and educational offices. Now, let me give a second example. In her now classic school ethnography, Penny raised a memorable and really is, I think, significant puzzle. What is the relationship between the regularity of the northern city's change shift, with its evidence gathered by random sampling and anonymous phone calls,
and the specific indexical meanings of the same variants, many of the same variants, pointing to identity categories such as jock and burnout at Belton High. It's hard to overemphasize. This is so important, this question, that it's hard to see its importance in that period. Faced with this profound challenge, some people stayed with the Lebovian recipe, sociological measures of individual speakers denoting, individual demographics, and their usage were simply correlated, phonological and other variables. Ethnography be damned. It's nothing, it's trivial. There were others like me, I have to admit, who gave up the correlational view altogether, sticking with the ethnographic categories. In my case, it was worker and peasant at that time. But from the start, Penny asked the interscalar question, the more important one, that is, how are these two related? The answer she gave was to expand the notion of social meaning. And she also tagged this as a meta question about measurement and scholarly perspective, not, as many thought, the real of social structure versus the ephemeral of experience. No, there's one political economy which is seen from different perspectives, the sociologists and the people, what we call on the ground. I love a quote from 1988 from Penny. I'm sure you didn't expect 1988 quotes. So, quote, category affiliation, as jock or burnout, is a significant predictor of phonological variation. Parents' socioeconomic class is not. Wow. Sound change is not mechanical as in relation to SES. It's not autonomous, not due to imitation of parents, nor to imitation of just any old peer group. And a few decades later, she wrote, the abstracted socioeconomic hierarchy provides a general roadmap, but it does not tell you what speakers at different places in the political economy are doing with those variables. I mean, that's cool. The so-called macro social structures like class and gender shape linguistic change only as they are made meaningful through ideological contrasts that people create in mediating institutions. And there are struggles in those institutions among variables that signal values like autonomy and cool, rowdiness and rules, and so on. Now, family resemblance exists between what Penny was doing then and what Judy Irvine and I have more recently called fractal recursivity in ideological work. And I would say the sociolinguistic correlations of demographic categories are the results over time of emergent social categories indexed by linguistic forms in interaction. I'm not sure that Penny would agree, but that's one way to square the circle. A third example starts once again with a puzzle. Sociolinguists, of course, track variables, and especially in the early years, but variables are themselves organized in a scalar way, as many people have already mentioned in the discussions we've had. They are organized into registers, also known as styles, and these scalar configurations make larger chunks that travel together and also do indexical work, and they convey something, not always linguistic. Remember the famous bell bottoms and peg legs. They convey in interaction something about contrasts of value and identity, or as Penny put it, a sound change or even an entire shift does not occur in its own, on its own in speech, but in the company of an endless variety of other variables as a component, not just of dialect, but of styles. And on the one hand, one can think about this as an registerment, but I think that Penny, as she has said both in writing and yesterday, is more interested in how one moves towards enregisterment, that is the interaction of variables before they're coagulated. That means further attention to uptake. How do people actually interpret what they see? And this is too a matter of perspective. I was delighted to be involved in getting Penny to write the ARA piece that put forth, I think, one of the first announcements of the third wave. And a quick final example has to do with scale within linguistic structure and its relation to meaning. In a recent paper, Penny examines the available sources of meaning across scale, or from morphosyntactic variables to phonological segmental features to pitch and prosody and voice quality. That is, these are different kinds of variables, but social indexicality is built into linguistic practice at every level of the linguistic system, she argues, but perhaps not in the same way. What she proposes is a cline of interiority, I'm quoting, from variables that index public social facts about the speaker to more internal, personal, affective states, unquote, sort of things that seem closer to the body. And I think this is yet again an interesting invocation, although not thematization, but really provocative invocation of the notion of scale. And I would say, let's look cross group, let's look cross sociologically and cross-culturally at how people understand these particular stations of the scale across, but there's a lot of interesting stuff to be done there. So undermining the concept of diglossia, then undermining pure correlationism and the study of singular variables, Penny is now rejecting an old linguistic truism, a true to form she's doing this, rejecting an old linguistic truism that there are separate semantic, pragmatic, and social meanings. No, not really. We should look to see how meaning in each one of those, social meaning in each one of those is communicated, because social meaning exists in each one of those. So a convergence, again, thinking in interscalar ways, innovates in both sociolinguistic and linguistic anthropological thought. So this is just a small history of the amazing body of work, ongoing and continually innovative in both sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology. Thank you.
Next, joining us via Zoom is Teresa Pratt talking about affect.
Thanks, Jeremy. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. I'm going to talk today about affect and meaning making in and through language, but I want to start with a story, like a few other people have. So maybe 10 years ago, this was early on in grad school, I hadn't done any field work yet. I was in a car with Penny and some other people, I don't remember who, and Penny said, through all the field work she'd ever done, there was no one she didn't like, which is kind of a surprising statement, but she qualified it by saying that people are likable because they fit into a picture. They're doing something in the space they operate in. That makes them interesting. Or at least that's how I paraphrased it in the notes app on my phone at the time, which I still have somehow. But I share this to emphasize, and this is in keeping with how Jeremy opened the session, Penny's consistent attention to what people are, quote, doing in the space they operate in. That's the central, part of her legacy. And I understand this to be somewhat more normalized in anthropology, linguistic anthropology. But as people have touched on, this goes against a lot of the structuralist and positivist underpinnings of linguistics in general and sociolinguistics in particular. This approach of hers also, of course, highlights the dialectic between structure and agency, which Penny does so well. And also meeting new people on their own terms is, or meeting people, I should say, on their own terms is part of what she called in her most recent book, her quote, Ant's eye view of the world, which I think is such a nice way of thinking about it. And I start with this anecdote, not just to personalize my comments, but because I'm talking about affect today. And in her 2010 paper, Affect, Sound, Symbolism, and Variation, where she also talks a lot about the iconicity that Annette was mentioning, Penny says that the importance of affective meaning in variation was forced on me. That's the quote. And she goes on to explain that in the elementary school, the social orders that we might expect to encounter and parse in adult and even in adolescent communities are not quite formed the way we might recognize them. Other aspects of meaning making, in this case affect, are at play and really visible. And so in that paper, she presents an analysis of 2 elementary school girls, one of whom Annette talked about, and their stylistic practice is just laden with affective displays, excitement, attitude, all the kind of emotional displays that they're exploring. And this drives their use of innovative variants of California vowels. And more recently, as we just heard about in her 2019 paper, the limits of meaning, she theorizes, again, that meaning potential of sociolinguistic signs can be understood along this line of interiority, or a scale, to use the term that Sue invites us to use, naming affective meaning as an ideological expression of one's so-called inner self. So that is, in this popular imaginary, emotion is seen as an inner state that gets translated outwardly. And Penny also notes, I think interestingly, that this coincides with a sense of intentionality or lack thereof. So when we think about emotion, they're thought to be somehow less consciously expressed, right? You can either wear your emotion on your sleeve or have to contain your emotions, but it's somehow less intentional that emotion is expressed. She goes on to offer that, of course, Silverstein theorizes orders of indexicality as moving from demographic categories to associations with those categories, that process of association can start anywhere, including affect. So in other words, we can see affect as fundamental to the semiotic landscape, just as the categories that are more conventionally involved in sociolinguistic inquiry and in general subject formation, studies of subject formation. I want to put these ideas in conversation with the critical race and feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, who's written extensively about affect, who in her 2004 article entitled Affected Economies emphasizes that an emotional state or mood doesn't reside in a given subject or object, but circulates between signifiers in relationships of difference or displacement. So she uses the example of this so-called happy family as an idealized affectively happy object, whose value or meaning emerges economically as it circulates, right? And people converge on this as some kind of positive thing. And further, just as speech act theory argues, Ahmed also proposes that emotions do things by aligning individuals within communities. And she also says, and bodily space within social space. I won't get into embodiment today, but it's certainly wrapped up with affect in interesting ways. And this helps us to situate affect within the semiotic landscape as something that's circulating and not something kind of internal, even though that ideology is important to as the background. So my own work on affect is based on an ethnography of a high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. And much like Penny, affect was something I found I needed once I got there. I arrived interested in assemblages of linguistic and embodied practice, but to understand this, I had to understand how, in this case, the cultural value of chill affect was circulating within the school. So sociolinguistic signs like creaky voice and slower speech rate co-constituted chill affect, as did embodied practices like bodily stillness. And in learning how the students saw themselves, quote, operating in their space, as Penny said, I saw that affect was as central to structuring their social life and the way they position themselves within the political economy as any number of macro social categories I may have attended to. And further, these qualities were wrapped up together. So it's not that affect was separate from other categories. It was used to express their their orientation to the institution of the high school. So being chill as being anti-institutional, but that position itself was classed. It had to do with how the students saw themselves positioned as fitting into the middle or working class options the school was offering them. And of course, there's a wider popular discourse of chill. For example, someone can have no chill, which backgrounds this and also reminds us to keep the local stylistic practice in conversation with the broader discourses that are happening. So this work linking affect to language variation builds on work done by others on this panel too, such as Judy's classic work contrasting excitability and calm among the Wolof, and Norma's discussion of toughness as affective. I think she also relies on the notion of affective economies in her 2011 paper. And this is, I would argue, and I like to think Penny would agree, because affect circulates in interaction as sociolinguistic signs are enacted, and thus is imbued in any of the styles and persona that we study. Thank you.
Next, we have Kira Hall talking about heterosexual markets.
Hello. So today I have 7 minutes to pay homage to what, in my view, is one of Penny Eckert's most powerfully provocative concepts, the heterosexual market. I am perhaps an unexpected person to give this talk. I'm known to at least some of my students, affectionately, of course, as Professor Queera, not Kira, given the work I've done on language and sexuality in India and in the area of queer linguistics more generally. But of course, all of us, even Professor Queera, are deeply affected by what Penny identifies as the heterosexual market. And if you've ever read her work on this topic, I guarantee you've seen yourself in her lively, evocative descriptions of the 5th grade crowd, whether you were someone who moved effortlessly and playfully within its social semiotics, or watched it with contradictory feelings of confusion and admiration and exclusion and inadequacy from the top of the monkey bars, which was my preferred position back in the day. I take this as an opportunity to praise Penny's work, which has been so fundamental to my thinking in linguistic anthropology and in language, gender, and sexuality, and also to situate her research as critical and as far ahead of its time. Penny has developed and refined the concept of the heterosexual marketplace across a series of articles that can be traced back to her short 1996 article, Vowels and Nail Polish, The Emergence of Linguistic Style in the Pre-Adolescent Marketplace, and continues through a recent review of the concept in the Oxford Handbook of Language and Sexuality, which compares and contrasts its on-the-ground emergence across 2 demographically contrastive schools. The early paper was published in the proceedings of the 1996 Berkeley Women in Language Conference, one of the 4 Berkeley conferences in the 1990s that put the study of language, gender, and sexuality on the map and set the stage for the later global development of the International Gender and Language Association. Penny was a hugely important voice in each of those conferences, providing new generations of scholars like myself with a way to think differently, or more specifically, with a way to think beyond the binary exclusions associated with the then popular 2 cultures approach to language and gender. That approach, as many of you know, assumes stark differences between women's and men's speech patterns and attributed those differences to patterns learned through language socialization in same-sex childhood playgroups. Penny, in contrast, as a variationist of class dynamics who move beyond static numbers, approach the topic of gender difference from a deeply ethnographic perspective, considering all of the semiotic stuff that goes into the everyday making of gender. In Penny Eckert's world of 1990s linguistics, gender was much more than 2. As a PhD student trying to find my way on the not always welcoming playground of linguistics at UC Berkeley, this was a crowd I wanted to be a part of. By a stroke of immense luck, Penny agreed to be on my dissertation committee, and here we are together at this panel in 2022. At a time when gender difference was attributed to the simple separation of categories, Penny said, no, not really. Instead, arguing that gender difference emerges at the precise point in the life cycle when male-female separation gives way, which, in much of the United States, happens in that until then barely noticed life stage known as pre-adolescence. The psychologists and sociologists who did the lion's share of research on life stages leading up to the 1990s were much more interested in adolescence, that supposed hotbed of sexual maturity and desire, as the primary mover of gender and sexuality. The sociologist Barry Thorne, whose book Gender Play I devoured in a graduate seminar in the early 1990s with Nancy Chodorow, brought pre-adolescence into focus, and Penny, the whole linguist, let us know why we too should care about a developmental stage so often underplayed as the nearly reaching of puberty associated with the maturing of sexuality. It's in the liminal time space of pre-adolescence that boys and girls on American playgrounds everywhere step into heterosexuality as a social imperative, dipping their toes into the intensive drama of boy-girl coupling that accrues socio-sexual capital for its most fluent female navigators and relegates the still Barney-loving rest to baby status. It's in this moment between babyhood and adolescence that heterosexuality becomes a developmental imperative, compelling 5th graders like Trudy, Katya, Erica just three of the dozens of lively and flamboyant personalities that surface in Penny's ethnographic work in Northern California elementary schools, to try on the more adult-like vowels and nail polish and even sexy underwear of those who have gone before them and who loom in the imaginary as icons of a less kid-like future. And it is in the emergence of this peer-based social order, which is only barely sexual, if at all, that signs of gender are recruited as signs of coupling. Judith Butler may have inspired us to rethink gender as a performative dependent on heterosexuality. But Penny showed us how to see the emergence of this relationship on the ground, or better said, on the playgrounds where a lot of nearly reaching is going on. What Penny shows us so vividly and so easily is that gender difference, now put on display by the crowd as a coupling device, takes on social meaning in pre-adolescence. And the girls who are good at navigating it, who are at the forefront of coupling their classmates into ever important boy-girl pairs that last, say, a day, are also the girls who front their O's in a predominantly white school like Steps, or back their A's in a predominantly Latinx school like Fields, both consistent with broader vowel shifts and progress within these two social demographics. How can sociolinguists answer that paradox of why women are found to lead in sound change? Penny gives us an answer, reminding us of the dense interconnection between sociolinguistic work and intersubjectivity, in this case, a flamboyant coupling intersubjectivity. What's in a vowel? Heterosexuality. Last night I was talking in the courtyard with some of you together with my 17-year-old daughter who had walked over from Boulder High. She's 17 now, it's true. I was expressing concern that I hadn't yet written this talk for this morning. I guess you could say I've been a little busy the past few months. So I took the opportunity to ask my daughter, Sophia, what she thought of this concept known as heterosexual markets. Now, my daughter is very wise. And at this moment in time, I am not, having poured out my last drop of higher thought into the planning of this conference. Sophia said, "Oh yeah, I know what that is." "You know this term?" I said. "Yeah," she says. "We did that when we were in the 7th grade. Most kids do it in the 5th grade, but we were late at my school." "What did you do?" I asked. And her response, simple but magnificent, kept me thinking all night. "We didn't know what we were doing. We just did it." Now, as a mom and adult who now sees all too clearly my teenage daughter's current struggles with the social semiotics of heterosexuality, my first inclination was to ask, well, do you know what you're doing now? But of course, this is the point. This is Penny's point. Heterosexuality presents itself to us as a prediscursive truth, but in fact, none of us really knows what it is. Rather, we bring it into being as we anticipate its meaning in the next life stage, and we then consolidate its meaning as we reflect on our naivety in a previous life stage. We can't underestimate the radical nature of Penny's repositioning of heterosexuality as a meaning-making practice, whether placed against the stifling binaries of US academic thought in the 1990s, or against the rise of worldwide movements condemning so-called gender ideology in the 2020s. To be clear, Penny's recontextualization of heterosexuality within the terms of marketplace emergence did a great deal of heavy lifting for the rest of us. Thank you, Penny, for your groundbreaking scholarship and for your collegiality and friendship all these years. And thank you most especially for being a true ally, an incredibly supportive humanist ally to an entirely new generation of scholars now at the center of that playground, whose work is geared to refusing the allure and power of those binary performances that you have so beautifully illuminated throughout your career. Thank you.
Up next, we have Norma Mendoza-Denton talking about vowels and nail polish. Perfect timing, good segue.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Vowels and nail polish. What can I say? As you might know, a lot of my work has revolved around makeup. So I thought I would go all out today. The mask gets in the way, as we know, those of us who are into makeup are, always running around with the spray setting thing. And the nails. Nowadays, too busy to actually go to a nail salon, so I just use the stickers. But hey, they work. Vowels and nail polish. There's so much in this tiny article, really the Trojan article that launched all of this different kind of work. For me, of course, the most natural thing would have been to talk about makeup and embodiment. But I decided to go a little bit of a different track because I think that the thing that I've been trying to figure out about this article and about language variation, semiotic variation, and embodiment in general is this piece that's highlighted. So girls become engaged in the technology of beauty and personality, learning to use a range of resources in which language use is elaborated along with the adoption of other resources. And that's from Vowels and Nail Polish. But what does this mean? For me, this is like a really big puzzle. It's a and I guess maybe it was Sue Gal that talked about different ways to try to put this together, right? You could statistically collapse everybody who has a particular resource that they're using, and then run that grouping against what linguistic behavior they have. And then you would get, some kind of result there. But that's really hard for some things. That's really hard for like lip gloss. Right? I mean, that's really hard for, at some point Penny did actually do like a scale of bell-bottom width. And you can do that for some things, but there's a lot of other, there's multiple layerings that would just capture like one variable. And if you were lucky, you could measure it. But most of life, we have language use has multiple variables, and the other resources are also multiple variables. And they're not varying by population, they're varying in time, in face-to-face interaction. So the problem becomes for me modeling covariation. In 2007 at the CLASP talk, I was going through my own stuff, like problems in modeling linguistic units of different types. This is a problem for me. How can we simultaneously display interval data, like the duration of non-modal voice quality, with point data, the specific moment of a vowel where one makes the measurement? How can we deal with nested variables like lexical frequency of the discourse marker like, and long VOT with its characteristic final consonant like, or multivariate variables? So all of these things are sort of scrambled in my head, and not even to mention the historicity of it, right? Like the work that Qing has been doing in the historical robustness of particular personae and styles. So for me, this is like a synchronic problem, a diachronic problem, a multivariate problem, and just in general, like a, mindfuck. Okay, so, I became interested in intonation and in gesture. So this is what it looks like when you transcribe gesture and intonation in TOBI, tones and breaks indices system. So you have, your apex of the gesture, your words, your tones, your breaks, and this is like me going like basically bananas on this data and trying to code everything out, right? This works to a certain extent. It's like bird whistle, like you kind of are trying to do everything. And then this is me like creating something I call the partiture system, trying to figure out like, okay, so I'm going to model the breathing with the pitch accent. and see how that works. Well, okay, it kind of works. Like you can do some things with this. And then, I'm thinking like, what is this partiture system for? You can interleave alignment of cross speaker effects with intonation units and the strength of breaks that are annotated in Toby. And you can align to the timestamp or the waveform. You annotate participation of material frameworks. You can stack features as in score systems. It's compatible with Pratt. Like I'm kind of trying to put it all together just from this one tiny thing that Penny said, and trying to align the interplay of speakers, like in diagraphs, like Dubois. So this is what I brought out in 2011 with my co-author Stephanie Janity, looking at metaphorical spatialization, the bird's eye view of an interaction where you have the speaker, Mary Jane, who was advocating for the legalization of marijuana and who was doing all of these gestures, along with the video in the second layer there, the waveform, then the apex layer, the pitch accent layer, and finally the words. I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we display what you can see at different time resolutions and also different viewpoints, right? And how these are all connected in terms of an unfolding interaction. This is with political speech that I collected in Arizona. Oh, wait. So why do I call it a partiture system? Basically, in Spanish, a musical score is called partitura. I'm sure partiture is not an English word, not before this. But I was also interested in, I had been at Ohio State thinking about gestural phonology and the ways in which you can annotate that as it goes along. So bringing together gesture, intonation, pitch accents, and point and interval data. And this really took me a long time to think about how to put that together, right? Like when something happens gradually, like creaky voice, there's not like one single point at which it happens. And then when something happens suddenly, like the apex of a gesture. And then, this has kind of evolved into trying to understand mediatized simultaneity. So you display language elements and visual elements through multimodal transcription. So you have your time-based phonetic elements and ambient sound displayed. And here I think this was in 2018, a paper on gangs on YouTube that came out in the racial linguistics volume, but still working on that one little suggestion by Penny in the vowels and makeup article. And this, of course, brings me to language embodiment and gendered revoicings and remediations, right? Where all of the stuff that Penny did with styles, with personae, and hopefully, plugging in Qing's historicity of personae can be seen in videos such as this one. For all my makeup lovers out there.
Caneras, mi rameras, no mames, hasta me sacan de onda que por un güey, no mames, mija, pues hay más culos que estrellas, y ya te la zapa, que te la fla, y cuando quiera cáigale, que aquí sí hay con queso las quesadillas, vaya, Tacubaya, si no conoce mejor ni vaya, se quiere medir los tenis, se quiere sacar la espina pa' pronto, ¿qué pasó con que también, como que ñoño soy el chavo, me extraña que siendo araña no se sepa ya.
So here you under the sort of umbrella of TikTok aesthetics, right? TikTok styles. You have chola, nerd, buchona, and white chicana, right? So, this is an entire genre of people kind of trying to select representative ways to do your makeup according to these styles. And of course, in the sort of the ones that my daughter watches are like, dark academia, kawaii, e-girl, visco girl, but this is the ones in Mexico are doing different things. And here they take specific evocative soundtracks and they revoice them, right? Sometimes people will revoice the soundtrack. Sometimes they just mouth along with it. And here's another different one. Cómo hablar como niña fresa. Right? This was very explicit.
Tutorial de cómo hablar como niña fresa. Pronuncia muchísimo las R's y las J's con un tonito al final. Habla con la voz rasposa.
And then finally, this last little image comes from Royal High. If any of you are were subjected to roadblocks during the pandemic, you will know that Royal High is a place where preteen people get together and put on outfits, and then they rate each other's outfits. So this is an outfit that this Roblox Royal High user based on old photographs of her Chicana aunt who was a Chola. Thank you very much.
Up next, we have a recorded video from Sharese Qing, whose topic is Where Do Ethnolects Stop?
Hi, I'm excited to be able to speak with you all about Penny Eckert's legacy and this quick talk about moving beyond the ethnolect. The ethnolect is the theoretical construct used in sociolinguistics to characterize an ethnic group's linguistic behaviors. Via this approach, or what Alim and Reyes characterized more broadly as the dialectal approach, linguists are concerned with classifying the frequency and distinctiveness of dialect features with respect to some ethno-racial information. As you can see in the examples listed here, these varieties are the dialects which have been named after various racial or ethnic groups in the country with African-American vernacular English, also termed African-American English or African-American language, as probably the most studied ethnolect of them all. Such characterizations view the speech of these groups as marked and may even delimit the kinds of features examined across them. Sociolinguists have offered critiques against the construct, with Eckert bringing these views front and center in her 2008 paper, Where Does the Ethnolect Stop? Eckert criticizes the field's tendency to characterize the speech of these speakers differently, depending on if they're Anglo or from minoritized populations. Specifically, she recognized the reservation of the term dialect for Anglo population, stating, in the dominant discourse of American dialectology, the white Anglo variety is considered a regional dialect, while African-American and Latino varieties are considered ethnic dialects, end quote. Such a practice lends itself to what she describes as a co-territorializing discourse that authenticates Anglo speech as local speech and participates in the larger practice of making Anglo speech the unmarked standard against which all other minoritized voices are compared in studies of regional variation. The kind of research which prioritizes the study of minoritized speech via the study of only ethnolectal forms focuses first and foremost on racial identity to the detriment of the other dimensions of identity. As a result, questions around how ethnic speakers use regional variables and the construction of a local identity are ignored in favor of keeping race at the forefront of the conversation around their linguistic practices. As a result, speakers who do not show or produce patterns consistent with the canonized ethnolectal forms for that group are viewed as not having legitimate membership in that racial or ethnic category, or they're seen as not being worthy of study. In this paper, Eckert disrupts this pattern of deterritorializing and hyperracializing minoritized speakers by examining the question, who gets to be local and how is locality done? In an ethnographic study of 2 middle schools in Northern California, Eckert finds that the raising pattern of "ah" in nasal context, an aspect of the California vowel shift, has different social meanings that go beyond ethnicity. That is, while the raising pattern is associated with Anglo speech and the non-raising pattern is associated with Latine communities, the deployment of either is based on its meaning in the student's everyday practice. A Latina can take up the pattern in her mostly Anglo school without the assumption it is a move away from her ethnic category. Simultaneously, in the mostly Latine schools, students who are members of the cool crowd can take up the non-raised pattern while being from other ethnic categories. Put simply, ethnicity alone does not determine linguistic behavior. This work is amongst the earliest to view racialized speakers as co-constructing rather than passively participating in regional sound changes. It also furthered conversation around the relationship between race and place, a topic that is near to my heart. Because of Eckert's work examining the social meaning of linguistic variables tied to different racial and ethnic categories, I've been inspired to look beyond the ethnolect as the starting point for examining the linguistic behavior of racialized speakers. That is, race can be overdetermined when we only view the indexicality of a limited set of features as marking a racial category and nothing more, as well as when we don't view variables outside of the ethnolect as capable of doing racial work. And recognizing that features can be resources to participate in different communities of practice and index different aspects of one's identity, we are moving toward a more multidimensional view of identity for racialized speakers. As Eckert's work inspires us not to take for granted what constitutes racial categories, I'll present to you my take on multidimensionality and why it's been so important for my work on the study of African Americans and their speech. If we were to imagine two different racial groups as shapes, one might be represented as a set of squares, while the other as a set of triangles. As you can see, what contributes to either squareness or triangularity are perhaps different kinds of the same type. When we make the shape the only axis across which we compare groups or examine a set of individuals, we neglect other dimensions of the shape. That is, our attendance to only shape or a single characteristic makes it such that we miss out on the other important dimensions, like color or even size. This analogy is to emphasize that seeing the totality of group one or two beyond their shapes is to see people as their racial selves, but more. Eckert has led the example in sociolinguistics to move beyond ethnic comparisons and toward the fuller person and seeing how they participate in their communities of practice. The move away from the theoretic construct of the ethnolect in favor of indexicality is a move to attend to race and the other social dimensions along which meaning is made for minoritized individuals and their communities. Thank you.
Up next, we have another recorded video from Andrew Wong discussing sociolinguistic icons.
What makes an icon an icon? Penny's broad-ranging research over the past 4 decades has opened up the study of the social meaning of linguistic variation. One of the many questions that she has tackled in her research concerns the meaning potential of sociolinguistic variables. We know that all variables have the potential to be socially meaningful, but why are some variables more likely to take on social meaning than others? In her seminal study of linguistic variation in Belton High, Penny identified 2 variables, eye-raising and negative concord, as having some kind of iconic status. The use as part of a speaker style, she explains, serves as a kind of roadmap for certain key social concerns. The iconic status of these 2 variables can be attributed to the simplicity and clarity of their social meaning, their easy separability from the rest of the linguistic system, and their use by iconic speakers when discussing key cultural themes. I've drawn inspiration from Penny's research on sociolinguistic icons for my project on language politics in post-1997 Hong Kong. I'm interested in understanding how linguistic differences between Hong Kongers and mainlanders have become magnified and ideologized. In the last few years, many Hong Kongers have clamored for the protection of Cantonese against the encroachment of Putonghua or Standard Mandarin. In debates over the status of Cantonese in Hong Kong, no other linguistic feature has attracted more attention than Cantonese tones. Observers have also highlighted qualities that are presumably shared by Cantonese tones and Cantonese speakers. So why has the Cantonese tone system, rather than some other linguistic feature, emerged as an icon in this politically charged climate? To understand why Cantonese tones have become iconic of Hong Kongers, I think we need to examine their linguistic properties and the nature of their indexical meanings. The Cantonese tone system is remarkable for its multifaceted nature, its indexical expansiveness, and what I call the storyability of its indexical meanings. By this, I mean the potential of these meanings to be woven into a coherent story. What is traditionally known as Cantonese tones encompasses segmental and suprasegmental features. Cantonese has 6 contrasting lexical tones, but traditional Chinese philology treats syllables with final stops as distinct tone classes, yielding a 9-tone system. Thanks to the multifaceted nature, Cantonese tones evoke a wide range of associations. They have been linked to Hong Kongers' supposed musical talents, the communicative efficiency of Cantonese, and the glorious past of the Chinese nation. By virtue of this indexical expansiveness, Cantonese tones provide rich material for the construction of a myth of Cantonese superiority, which depicts Cantonese as more authentically Chinese than Putonghua, and Cantonese speakers as the true guardians of traditional Chinese culture. While Northerners often stereotype Cantonese people as unruly, this myth of Cantonese superiority allows Hong Kongers to flip the script and invert denigrating stereotypes as a means of reaffirming their own Chineseness. So what makes an icon an icon? I've discussed 3 characteristics that facilitate the transformation of the Cantonese tone system into an icon: multifacetedness, indexical expansiveness, and the storyability of indexical meanings. I can't help but wonder, are these not the characteristics that account for Penny's status as an iconic figure in sociolinguistics? Multifacetedness. Penny is a variationist, but she's also an ethnographer, and she's made significant contributions to our understanding of education, youth culture, and the relationship between language, gender, and sexuality. Indexical expansiveness. Penny is linked to many key concepts in our field: community of practice, indexical field, third wave variationism, and client of interiority. Storyability of indexical meanings. Penny's most recent book, Meaning and Linguistic Variation, offers an intellectual autobiography that explains how all these concepts come together to form a coherent story about the search for meaning in sociolinguistic variation. However, what I find most compelling about this book is her personal reflections. Penny has shown us how to overcome obstacles with grit and determination. For whatever reason, success comes easily to some people. To the rest of us, Penny's story offers hope and inspiration. This, I believe, is one of her most enduring lessons for future generations of sociolinguists and linguistic anthropologists.
Up next, we have Kit Woolard talking about diglossia.
Wonderful. Great, thank you. So my first sociolinguistics course as an undergrad was also one, I think it was the very first that Penny taught at Michigan. This means I'm old enough to remember a brilliant Eckert publication. I'm not going there. You draw the implicatures.
A brilliant publication that some of you may not know, although Sue knows it, Diglossia, Separate and Unequal from 1980, when we still wrote on parchment. Penny has reported recently that she wrote it in a weekend. People no longer debate whether diglossia leads to minority language maintenance or shift, but there's nothing out of date about this article. It shows that Penny was an anthropologist of the total linguistic fact from the very start. She saw the paradoxical dynamism of social indexicality before we all knew the word indexicality, much less indexical order. She argued that a diglossic structure is both a force that allows speakers to store the system and a force that gives rise to shifts within the system over time. Her analysis anticipated other concepts we rely on now, such as creative indexicality, rematization, erasure, the indexical field, fractal recursivity, and scale jumping, obviously not in those words, of course. So let me show you in Penny's words, and I'll just give some glosses and current terminology. Penny argued that in the Gascon village she studied, language shift began with the social indexicality of language that was imported along with public education in French. A high language brings its own speech events with it when it is introduced into a low-speaking community, she wrote. As Galen Irvine recently reminded us, social indexicality of one sign is not independent from others. And indeed, Penny wrote, the very existence of a high implies a low. And the imposition of the standard language creates an immediate social opposition between the standard and the vernacular. So this does something. This indexical relation of contrast becomes creative as these high events then become part of the official justification for the imposition of the high language. And Gascon ceased to be adequate for all situations within the village. This perceived situational inadequacy of Gascon came to be rematized, we would say, and located within the language itself. The events of the community are defined partially by the language they occur in, she wrote, and each language in turn is defined by its events. Because Gascon wasn't written, French teachers viewed it as inherently inadequate for logical abstract thought and viewed its monolingual speakers as incapable of such thought, she wrote. That view was embodied, Eckert said, or iconized, as we would say, or embodied, as we would now say, in the peasant's wooden shoe tied around the students' necks if they spoke Gascon. Once this exclusionary process had begun, the high-low distinction recurred at ever more intimate orders, displacing the language further. So when it was first associated with teachers and government officials, French was viewed as an outside language for the villagers. But as new speech events entered the community, old events such as ranking songs associated with communal labor were eliminated in what Galen Irvine have called register stripping. Penny wrote, all of this is at least a paraphrase and a few quotes here. She wrote, the economic and educational association of the high language makes the low language sound uneducated and poor by comparison. So in response, Gascon speakers deployed second-order indexical strategies that exploited this structure of contrast. Reassignment, she wrote, as French domains became a strategy for saving Gascon domains themselves from stigmatization. The very use of French began to have the power of dignifying situations, creative indexicality. This is to say that what we now call fractal recursivity, thanks to very good friends, brought high-low differentiation to an ever more micro-social scale. The opposition French-Gascon moved from outside inside the village to public versus private domains within it, bringing the opposition into the community, Penny wrote. Public conversations in everyday life came to be in French, and Gascon's power for public use was itself erased. As this distinction was fractally reproduced, I would say, the social meanings associated with each language became increasingly complex, Penny wrote. But this complexity is always along the same general lines. Does this sound familiar? This is clearly what Penny has since called an indexical field. The high-low opposition was then reproduced at a still more intimate scale, differentiating kinds of people. Those who acquired French and succeeded in the mainstream economy were distinguished from the Gascon speakers, so-called left behind. And then in the next step, diglossia was internalized within the South as code switching. Code switching as internalized diglossia. The individual self-image had come to incorporate both languages, and they need to express different aspects of their own personalities in different languages. Finally came the brutal conclusion of the creative logic of stable diglossic contrast, that the language must disappear in order for the community to retain a positive self-image. So, a diglossic structure of differentiation remained ideologically stable at the same time as it motivated language shift, as it was reproduced recursively, we would now say, across scalar indexical orders, creating an indexical field of new meanings that were always organized around the same high-low axis of differentiation, Penny told us. Gascon was erased first ideologically and then in practice. Now, Penny gave us a case analysis, not the systematic conceptual apparatus that we're able to draw on now, thanks to the work of Michael Silverstein, Sue and Judy, Penny herself, and others. But still, this was a pretty good start for a weekend's work.
Up next, we have Zhang talking about style.
Thank you, Kira and Jeremy, for organizing this panel and including me in this panel. So I will discuss Effort's view on style and its contribution to linguistic anthropology. Style is at the core of Eckert's theorization on the third wave of variation in sociolinguistics. Foregrounding style in the third wave shifts the focus from sound change to viewing a language variation as semiotic resource and social practice. This aligns with the linguistic anthropological perspective of language as a cultural resource and a social tool, and language use as social action. Eckert's theorization on style enables an integrated treatment of language and social change that embeds linguistic variation within broader social ideological processes. Slide. In variation and personal group style, Eckert and her then graduate students laid out the first perspective on style that gave rise to the third wave. This statement, you can see, includes the key ideas about style that are further developed in her later works. Jeremy has elaborated on bricolage. I will focus on some of the other aspects of style. Slide. So content, form, meaning, and ideology. Slide. These 4 aspects highlight the emergent nature of style. As a bricoleur engage in stylistic moves, there is a potential for change in any or all of the above dimensions. As style is mediated by ideology, changing ideology will also lead to changes in the content, form, and the meaning of style. Emphasizing the emergent nature of style and treating it as an open-ended process of bricolage locates the investigation of style within the socio-political circumstances and exigencies of particular historical moments, drawing attention to the question why a particular new style comes to be and get noticed at a particular historical juncture. Such a question is pivotal in developing an analysis of language use and change as part and parcel of social change. Slide. Eckert's view on style precludes this separation of form from content. Linguistic and other semiotic resources constitute both the content of style as well as the various ways in which differentiation and distinction are produced. It has inspired my own work on a style-based approach to language and social change in China. My previous work examines the emergence of cosmopolitan Mandarin as a new semiotic resource. It's a new linguistic style whose emergence participates in diversifying the semiotic landscape of contemporary China. Furthermore, cosmopolitan Mandarin becomes part of the semiotic resources of other changes in content, including new types of being, for example, a new type of Chinese business professionals, and a new type of trendy ebullient feminine persona. Slide. With respect to form, how resources are used and how they are combined. In other words, how distinction is produced in various ways. Eckert's research focuses on the examination of sociolinguistic variation, particularly how the linguistic resources without referential meaning, or the pure indexicals, create social meaning beyond the content or what is said. The indexical power of language has been an insistent focus of linguistic anthropologists. However, we can benefit more from an emphasis on the pure indexicals to achieve a more nuanced analysis of social meanings when such meanings are not accessible in the same way when we analyze social indexicals with referential content. Losing such nuances may contribute to erasure and simplification of the social complexities of the people we study, and even reproduce stereotypes. Slide. The meanings of social distinction are created in the production and interpretation of style. As Sally will elaborate on social meaning, I will not spend any more time on this. Ideology. Styles as systems of distinction are fundamentally ideological. As the distinctiveness of a style becomes meaningful when contrasted with other styles, ideology mediates people's understanding and construal of socially salient poles of distinction. It further shapes the interpretation and evaluation of stylistic elements and practices. Examining the interpretation of a style, including its linguistic components, reveals how small stylistic moves are linked to broader social and political concerns. In my work, for example, interpretations of the use or non-use of rhoticization and the contrast between full tone and neutral tone reveal contesting ideas about authenticity and morality and what gets to be the legitimate voices of a modern globalizing China. Slide. So a style-based approach, that is, treating variation as meaning-making resources in the construction of style, enables an integrated treatment of language and social change. Linguistic variation or innovation as emergent stylistic resources constitute the content of what is changed. It affords the resource for making new social distinctions by bringing about how it is different. The meanings of the new distinction are constructed in the production and interpretation of the style. Such an approach embeds linguistic change within larger social ideological processes. Finally, I want to say thank you, Penny, for your inspiration, mentoring, and friendship. You helped me grow intellectually from a graduate student from China who wanted to work on, I wasn't planning to do this, who wanted to work on change in how Chinese speakers do speech acts as a reflection of social change in China, to who I am now, seeing language change as a force in social change. Thank you.
So for our last topic, we have a recorded video from Sally McConnell-Ginet talking about social meaning.
Hi, I'm Sally McConnell-Ginet at Cornell. I'm delighted to be part of this panel celebrating Penny Eckert's work. I'm just sorry I can't be there in person. I want to start by talking a little bit about Penny's work on social meaning. In her 2000 book called Linguistic Variation as Social Practice, she presents a quantitative study and very insightful analysis of language variation in the Detroit area high school. It's she calls it Belton High, and it's the same school she described in her 1989 Jocks and Burnouts. And there she really begins using the terminology of social meaning and talking about it in very explicit ways. Then in the more recent 2019 intellectual memoir and collection of papers ranging from 1980 to 2008, and the final chapter actually basically appears as a 2019 glossa paper. In that book, she really explores with enormous insight the idea of the social meaning of linguistic variation. And she had these ideas, but we didn't use much the terminology of social meaning in our collaborative work on language and gender, though it was very much, we did talk about the meaningfulness of linguistic diversity and linguistic variability. My own background is in formal semantics and pragmatics with a lot of influence from philosophy of language. And so I had been forced to begin thinking a little more socially when I started teaching about language and gender in 1973. And though colleagues and students had pushed me to read, well, particularly feminist anthropology and linguistic anthropology, getting me thinking in more productive ways than I first was. It wasn't until I met Penny and we began working together that I really started reading social theory, and she introduced me to people like Bourdieu, to Goffman's work, and of course the idea of communities of practice in Levin-Wenger's work. And all of that gave a framework for putting together some ideas that both she and I had about meaningfulness of women's activities, including women's use of language. And though we hadn't always used the language of social meaning to talk about this, it was certainly important. Penny's paper in 1989, just before we started collaborating, The Whole Woman, the paper from which this panel takes its title, of course, is emphasizing that women are active agents doing things with others, as these pictures suggest, that their language use is not simply determined by the larger social categories to which demographers assign them. Also, that these categories are not completely independent of one another. So linguistically attentive ethnographic studies like Penny's work and the social practice theory to which she introduced me suggest alternative ways of thinking, not only about gender and language, but more generally about the many kinds of meaning at play in linguistic interactions. At that point, we were talking about women and men, but now the landscape, the social landscape is widened to include trans people, non-binary people, and of course, to begin looking at lots of other kinds of social identities and kinds of social personae that inhabit the social world, the sociolinguistic world. In the end of her memoir in the 2019 paper as well, Penny proposes that what fundamentally drives phonological change is social meaning. And the guy here is saying, I've learned to give up when I hear Brooklyn in your voice. He's obviously not talking about one particular phonological variable, but about a constellation that produces this very forceful Brooklyn persona that he is reluctant to confront. Penny says, notes that phonological variation is very special because it lacks reference that enables it easily just to layer social meaning on the content of utterances. But things do get more interesting, or let's say more complicated. Variables are not alone in language. They blend into a heterogeneous system. Language is not simply referential, it's also expressive. And I hadn't thought about it this way really before, but in a lot of my own recent work is really exploring how lexical change is not only driven by, but is also part of social change and often social conflict. And by lexical change, I mean both changes in the lexical inventory, new words come, old words go, but also changes in the referential meaning assigned to particular linguistic forms. And an example I've discussed at some length is the meaning of the word marriage and the way the whole debate over the role of gender in differentiating potential marriage partners has been contested. And is that a linguistic matter? No, not only. It's a social matter, but it's also a linguistic matter. The two mesh. Social meaning is the glue that, connects the linguistic and the social. And I, hope that people who are working on phonological meaning will find room for people like me who are working in a very different area, because I think like phonological changes in the lexicon happen only because they are socially meaningful. And I want us not to limit the notion of social meaning to sets of inferences that are licensed. That's too much like some rather constrained ways of thinking of semantic meaning without looking at how it works in practice. So I would urge us to follow Penny's lead and think very practically. The proposal I make for defining social meaning is this: the social meaning of producing any linguistic unit lies in the effects thereby produced on the social landscape, the contributions made by that linguistic move to ongoing social practice. They may include license inferences, but also obligations incurred, alliances made, stances taken, and much more. You all know this. Penny's taught you. And I want to thank her and the panel organizers. And I will stop sharing and stop the
Finally, we have Penny Eckert.
shit. At first, when Jay began, I thought I would cry, but I didn't. This has just been amazing. And this collection of people, it's like looking at my professional life sort of across the times. And of course, you know, those of you who know me and those of you who have read my latest confessional book know that, I hope you know that the reason I've been able to do the things I've done, the reason I've been able to sort of move away from the sort of intellectual practice that I was trained in and try to twist it in other directions is because I always expected to fail. So it didn't really matter if I said things that other people thought were wrong or stupid. And well, yeah, I was to say maybe I didn't expect to succeed. I think I expected to fail is a pretty good way of looking at it. But at any rate, when I look, I've sat here watching all the, how much time do I have? 2 minutes? Oh, well, I mean, sort of going through all of these, I mean, one talk after another, each of these people, somebody I really adore. And seeing sort of my life move through, my whole professional life moving through these people, it's at first I thought, okay, I'm taking notes, what everybody said, you know, but no, I'm not the discussant, right? I'm just here. And I wanted to start, I think, sort of by saying that, so we go, if I go back kind of historically, I think the first of these people that I knew was Kit. And, you know, Kit was my undergraduate student, and I told her she should go to Berkeley, and she did. Good girl. And then, of course, we sort of gradually saw each other, you know, we'd run into each other at a AAA meeting, and then eventually it became clear that our work had a lot to do with each other. And so Kit has just sort of traveled this entire distance, right? And then there's Sally. Now, Sally and I first met at a conference at our alma mater, Oberlin, that Joel Scherzer, who was my classmate, organized. And he'd invited, because there was no linguistics at Oberlin. So Joel invited a bunch of graduates of Oberlin who would become linguists to come and give talks. And it was wonderful. Among other things, the intellectual discourse at Oberlin is something that I have not encountered anywhere in any other university in the same way, except among the sociolinguists. And that's complicated, but just the way the institution was set up for real exchange is something I certainly have not encountered in most other institutions. And so Sally and I just got to talking then. And then when I started getting interested in gender, I didn't know anything about gender. I mean, I had been a feminist from, you know, birth, and I was heavily involved in the feminist movement in the 60s. But when I saw stuff on language and gender, I thought, I don't know, you know. And so then when I really began to see that there was some interesting stuff in variation, I didn't like the way my colleagues were talking about gender and variation. I went to Sally and I said, you know, this is going to the fountainhead, you know, I was going to really learn about gender. And so, and from then on, Sally and I worked over and over again, and it was a tremendously, hugely formative relationship that lasted and has been always wonderful. And then Sue. we met, I think, as Sue said, at this conference, and we had both just recently finished our dissertations. And Sue gave this amazing talk, and she was just I was so impressed by her. She was so sophisticated, and she was talking about social networks, and that just really blew me away. And just had a tremendous effect on me. And Sue just always sort of stayed there, and then gradually over time, and then of course I got to know Judy. And so that you think about your career as unfolding through the things you do, but it's really the people you begin to talk to, and the people that you get to know and love or not love. And then there was Kira. Now, Kira was at Berkeley, and Kira and Mary Buckholtz were both sort of struggling to be sociolinguists in a department that didn't do sociolinguistics. And those two people are the most brilliantly self-educated people I have ever met. I mean, when you think what Mary and Kira have done and what kind of support they had as students to do that. And so they came in, and so Mary asked John Rickford to be on her committee, and Kira asked me to be on her committee. So we got this little, and by then, of course, Kira had already done quite a bit of her dissertation. And I have to say, it was the most fascinating experience because I learned more. I learned far more from Kira than she learned from me doing that dissertation. Absolutely, don't shake your head, Kira. It's just really true. And then there's Norma, who was my first student at Stanford. And actually that vowels and nail polish paper I wrote while Norma was doing vowels and nail polish with gang girls. So she was there doing eye makeup and all of this stuff. And so I learned so much about this stuff sort of with and through Norma. And then along came Qing and Andrew. And Qing and Andrew were part of the cohort, very important parts of that cohort that developed, became a really third wave thinking. It was then, and in fact, and Judy, did you come to that too? Or Judy, Kira? I remember Judy came to our seminar when we were doing this. But at any rate, I mean, I've often said that this third wave thingamajig is not something I invented. It's something that we all developed as time moved on through Stanford cohorts. And of course I have to say, Andrew is the most, I'm so, Sue was just telling me that she just taught Andrew's paper and that it was such a great paper. Andrew is the most modest linguist I know. I just had to point that out because it's just, and with Qing, I really came to understand the relation between social change and linguistic variation. I mean, her work on Mandarin just really helped me understand what this is all about. And then, of course, we come to the Sharese King. Jay and Annette and Teresa, who are of a cohort, the most recent cohort with all new kinds of stuff, sort of taking that third wave thing and building things like building iconicity into it, and Sharese's work on the diversity of the African American community and of language, of the variation in the African American community is really the first work that breaks down and truly breaks down that ethnolectal barrier, right, or whatever it is. Of course, when Annette took up in that first seminar, took up iconicity. The first paper I ever wrote in linguistics was on iconicity, was on sound symbolism. So I just felt like it's just a really exciting thing for me. And then, of course, then Teresa goes and does a high school ethnography. Oh, yay. But at any rate, so I just do this. I was just really lucky. I just been lucky, just lucky to have all these to have all these great people. And you know, when Jay says that I really saw them, right? Well, there's so much to see, just so much to see, and so much to see in all of these people and everybody in this room, but I haven't seen it all. So what can I say? Thank you so much. You have actually made me think maybe I did something smart.